You know what happens when you stop being available to avoidance? You stop outsourcing your self-worth. And that right there is the turning point. Most people don't realize how much emotional energy they've been leaking trying to decode someone who keeps them at arm's length. You spend days analyzing their texts, weeks wondering what you did wrong, and months convincing yourself that crumbs of connection are better than nothing. But here's the truth. When you stop being readily available to someone who is emotionally avoidant, what you're really doing is reclaiming your clarity. You're reclaiming your dignity. Now let's talk psychology for a second. Avoidant attachment is not about you. It's not about your worthiness, your beauty, your intellect, or how much you tried. Avoidants operate from a deep-rooted fear of emotional closeness. Intimacy equals danger to them. Because somewhere in their early development, connection became linked to overwhelm, unpredictability, or even neglect. So what do? They create space. They pull away. They downplay your importance, not because you're not important, but because acknowledging your importance would make them vulnerable. And that's their biggest fear. But when you're someone who leans anxiously attached or simply someone who values deep connection, it becomes a toxic dance. You feel their withdrawal and instinctively lean in harder. You offer more. You accommodate more. You wait longer. And with every step you take toward them, they take another step back. This dynamic chips away at your confidence, your sanity, and your sense of reality. You start doubting yourself instead of questioning the imbalance. That's why stopping, stepping back, going quiet, pulling your energy inward is not about punishing the avoidant. It's about rescuing yourself. It's about making a decision, maybe for the first time, that you get to choose who has access to you, that your emotional availability is not an open bar for anyone to walk in and drink from. What's fascinating is what happens next. The fog starts to lift. The overthinking slows down. You stop checking your phone every 5 minutes, waiting for the validation hit that never really satisfied you anyway. You begin to hear your own voice again, the one that was drowned out by all the noise of maybe if I just say it differently, they'll respond. That voice starts reminding you you are not hard to love. Some people are just emotionally unequipped to meet you where you are. And that's not a character flaw on your part. That's a moment of discernment. Philosophically speaking, there's something deeply liberating about choosing to no longer contort yourself to fit into someone else's limited emotional bandwidth. Soren Kierkegaard once said that the most common form of despair is not being who you are. That's exactly what this is. When you constantly chase connection with someone avoidant, you start shrinking, editing your needs, softening your voice, second-guessing your intuition. That's despair wearing a mask. And the act of becoming unavailable is the act of choosing yourself over despair. Because here's the part no one tells you. Clarity doesn't come from getting answers from them. Clarity comes from getting honest with yourself. What did it cost you to keep showing up for someone who barely met you halfway? What did it cost you to constantly manage their discomfort while ignoring your own? When you stop being available, you start facing those questions head on. And it's uncomfortable, yes, but it's also the beginning of real emotional maturity. You realize that love isn't supposed to feel like waiting to be chosen. It's not supposed to feel like guessing games and walking on eggshells. It's supposed to feel safe. And if someone's avoidance doesn't allow for that, then choosing distance isn't giving up, it's waking up. And look, I'm not saying it's easy. You're going to want to reach out. You're going to want to explain yourself one more time. But don't mistake your urge to connect with a signal that they're your person. Sometimes that urge is just old wiring firing up, neurochemistry tricking you into thinking pain equals passion. It doesn't. That's trauma bonding, not love. So, when you finally say, no more, I'm not playing this game, you're not being cold. You're being conscious. You're choosing alignment over attachment. And that shift, that's where your power lives. You don't need to be available to people who aren't available to themselves. Let that sit for a moment. Because when you truly internalize that, you stop chasing ghosts and start building a life rooted in reality. You stop handing over your peace in exchange for the hope that someone might one day show up. You show up for yourself, and that changes everything. The moment you stop making yourself available to avoidance is the moment you become fully available to your own growth. And that's a relationship worth fighting for. There's something nobody really prepares you for when you step back from an avoidant: the reaction. The silence that used to feel like punishment suddenly flips. Because for the first time, the avoidant is the one sitting with discomfort they can't rationalize away. Here's the psychology behind it. Avoidant individuals are wired to suppress their attachment needs. They minimize emotional closeness, not because they don't need it, but because they've trained themselves not to trust it. Their people had contingent, emotionally inconsistent, emotionally overwhelming or overly demanding, where closeness came at the cost of autonomy or safety. So now they cope by keeping people at a distance, even people they care about, especially people they care about. But emotional avoidance is not immunity. It's delay. It's deflection. And when you stop being available, when you stop texting, stop initiating, stop orbiting their world, they lose control of the dynamic they've grown comfortable in. Your absence disrupts their illusion of emotional safety. It pokes at the wound they've built their defenses around. What most people miss is this: avoidants do feel deeply. They just don't process those feelings in real time. They suppress, they distract, they rationalize. But when you're no longer there to chase them, accommodate them, or emotionally regulate for them, all of that suppressed emotion has nowhere to go. And eventually, it surfaces to them. They might not show it the way you expect. There probably won't be an emotional outpouring or a grand gesture. More often, they'll feel a vague unease, restlessness, irritation, a sudden curiosity about what you're doing, why you're quiet, whether you've moved on. They may even reach out, not out of readiness, but out of disruption. Your absence has become louder than your presence ever was. But discomfort they feel, it's not about you abandoning them. It's about them facing the parts of themselves they've avoided for years. It's about them sitting in the emotional space that was previously filled by your energy, your reassurance, your pursuit. Now, here's the philosophical edge. When you remove yourself from someone's life, not as a punishment, but as an act of self-preservation, you become a mirror. You reflect back to them everything they were trying not to see: their patterns, their fears, their inability to connect. You are no longer the distraction from their discomfort. You are the catalyst for it. And while that might sound vindicating, let's be clear. Your job is not to fix, teach, or prove a point. Your job is to protect your peace. You stepping back isn't a strategy to get them to change. It's a boundary. It's you saying, I won't shrink myself to make your fear of intimacy feel safe. That takes strength, it takes clarity, and it takes a deep commitment to your own emotional well-being. And when you're no longer available, the avoidant is forced to reckon with a new reality. Connection isn't something they can indefinitely postpone. It has consequences. Real people walk away. Real intimacy requires participation. And when they can no longer rely on your consistent presence to soothe their anxiety from a distance, they face a crossroads: grow or retreat deeper. And yes, sometimes they retreat. That's hard. But again, that's information, not rejection. It tells you where they are in their emotional evolution. It's not a reflection of your value. It's a reflection of their capacity. Other times, the shift sparks something. It nudges their awareness. It starts a slow, messy process of reflection. But even if it doesn't lead to reconnection, it still matters. Because you changed the dynamic. You broke the loop. And that's powerful. Here's the thing. Emotional unavailability doesn't always look like cruelty or indifference. Sometimes it looks like charming inconsistency, like a perfectly timed text just when you've started to let go. But if you look closer, it's often less about love and more about managing their own anxiety. They're not always reaching for you. They're reaching for relief. Relief from the quiet that your absence created. That silence, that space, it presses on the void they've worked hard to ignore. And in that moment, you face a choice. Do you step back into the old rhythm just because it feels familiar? Or do you hold the line and allow discomfort to do what comfort never could? Transform the pattern. Because the truth is, growth rarely happens in comfort. For the avoidant, discomfort is often the first real crack in the wall they've built around their heart. And for you, it's the space where your clarity gets louder, your standards get higher, and your intuition gets sharper. So no, you're not cold for stepping away. You're not selfish. You're not dramatic. You're awake. And when you wake up to the truth of your worth, you stop participating in dynamics that make you question it. Let them sit with the silence you once filled. Because in that silence, both of you might finally hear what the noise was drowning out. Let's talk about the cycle. You know the one. You reach out, they pull back. You text, they delay. You over-explain, they under-respond. And around it goes. The anxious avoidant loop isn't just frustrating, it's exhausting. But more than that, it's addictive. Yes, addictive. Because underneath the roller coaster of highs and lows, something deeper is happening. Your nervous system is getting hooked on inconsistency. That might sound strange, but here's what the science says. The anxious avoidant trap is a survival strategy rooted in childhood conditioning. When you're anxiously attached, you likely grew up around love that was conditional or unpredictable. Affection came with strings, validation wasn't always available, and when it was, it felt fleeting. So now, as an adult, uncertainty feels familiar. You equate the emotional roller coaster with connection. And avoidantly attached people, they fit perfectly into that script. They keep their distance just enough to activate your fear of abandonment, but not so far that you fully detach. That tension, it mimics the very environments many of us grew up in, and your brain, wired to seek what it knows, interprets that stress as love. So you chase, you overfunction, you try to fix, you shrink to fit, and they retreat, not out of malice, but out of habit. Avoidants manage their inner world by minimizing emotional intensity. They were taught, often indirectly, that vulnerability equals loss of control. So when you get close, they get overwhelmed. Their nervous system responds with flight, not fight. The more you pursue, the more they retreat. And so the cycle strengthens. Here's the problem. Both sides feel trapped. The anxious person is always scanning for signs of rejection, reading between the lines, trying to preempt abandonment. The avoidant is always scanning for threats to their independence, guarding their autonomy like it's the last thing keeping them safe. And in the middle, a connection that never quite lands. Just enough intimacy to stay hopeful, but never enough to feel secure. So how do you break it? You stop dancing. That sounds simple, but it's one of the hardest things you'll ever do because it goes against everything your attachment system is screaming at you to do. Your instincts say, try harder. But healing begins when you do the opposite. When you pause. When you stop proving, stop pleading, stop chasing emotional breadcrumbs, and start listening to what this dynamic is actually telling you. Because every time you overextend to make the relationship work, you reinforce the very imbalance that's hurting you. You signal that your needs can wait, that your boundaries are negotiable, that as long as they don't leave, you'll bend. And over time, that becomes your identity in the relationship, the one who holds everything together. And that's not love. That's survival. Breaking this cycle means choosing discomfort now over devastation later. It means risking distance in order to reclaim your self-worth. When you stop engaging in the anxious avoidant tug-of-war, you shift from being reactive to being reflective. You stop trying to decode someone else's behavior and start understanding your own patterns. You ask deeper questions, like, why does unpredictability feel so magnetic to me? Or what part of me believes I have to earn love instead of receive it freely? And for the avoidant, if they're willing, your detachment can be a wake-up call. It can be the interruption they never expected, an emotional jolt that challenges their avoidance as a sustainable strategy. But whether or not they rise to the challenge isn't your responsibility. Your responsibility is to stop repeating dynamics that deplete you, to heal the parts of yourself that confuse inconsistency with intensity. Philosophically, this is the journey of individuation, of becoming whole. Carl Jung talked about how we must confront the shadow parts of ourselves in order to grow. In the anxious avoidant cycle, both parties are operating from the shadow. The anxious person hides their fear of not being enough behind over-functioning. The avoidant hides their fear of being consumed behind withdrawal. Neither is truly connected to themselves, let alone each other. So when you step out of the cycle, you're not just ending a dysfunctional pattern, you're reclaiming your identity. You're saying, I will no longer confuse emotional volatility with emotional depth. I will no longer accept inconsistency as a substitute for intimacy. And yes, that will be lonely at first. You'll miss the highs, the rush, the hope that maybe this time it'll be different. But what you gain is so much more powerful. Peace, self-respect, emotional alignment, and the space to attract someone who meets you with presence, not resistance. Because in the end, love is not a chase. It's not an argument you win. It's a meeting of two people who are emotionally ready to show up consistently, calmly, clearly, step out of the loop, and watch what opens up when you stop confusing pain with passion. When you finally stop making yourself emotionally available to avoidance, something subtle but incredibly powerful begins to happen. Your nervous system recalibrates. Your inner world, once ruled by urgency and doubt, begins to settle. And in that stillness, something extraordinary emerges. Space. Space for self-respect, space for discernment, space for secure love. This is where everything shifts. Because let's be honest, when you're caught in the dynamic with an avoidant, your internal compass gets scrambled. You start confusing unpredictability with chemistry, emotional distance with mystery, and anxiety with desire. You spend so much time trying to anticipate their behavior that you forget to examine your own. And over time, your standards lower, not because you don't know what you deserve, but because you're too exhausted to keep hoping for something better. But the truth is, there is something better. There are people out there who are not afraid of intimacy, people who want connection, who aren't turned off by consistency, who won't run when things get real. And you'll never see them, not clearly, not fully, if you keep making yourself available to people who aren't emotionally capable of showing up. This isn't just about who you attract. It's about who you recognize. See, secure people often feel boring to someone who's been conditioned for chaos. When you're used to love being a puzzle you have to solve, someone who simply says what they mean and follows through on their words can feel unfamiliar, even suspicious. But that's not because they're wrong for you. That's because they don't activate your trauma pattern. And that's why this part of the process matters so much. Because by stepping back from avoidance, by breaking the loop, by choosing to sit with your discomfort instead of chasing connection, you begin to rewire what feels normal to you. And that rewiring, that's where freedom lives. From a psychological standpoint, this is called earned security. It's the process of becoming secure in your attachment, not because you were raised that way, but because you consciously choose new patterns. You decide that your peace is more important than your craving for intensity. You choose partners who are emotionally present over ones who are emotionally unavailable but charismatic. You begin to redefine what love feels like in your body, and for the first time, safety starts to feel like home instead of a threat. But it takes work. It takes unlearning. It takes sitting in the silence after stepping away from the avoidant and realizing that your loneliness is not evidence of failure, it's evidence of detox. You're detoxing from inconsistency. You're detoxing from self-abandonment. You're detoxing from the idea that love has to be earned through suffering. And once that detox clears, something clicks. You begin to feel the difference between being chosen and being chased. You stop assigning value to people who don't value you. You stop over-explaining your needs to people who were never listening in the first place. You stop trying to turn emotional runners into relational anchors. And here's the philosophical depth of it all. When you reclaim your emotional energy, you become a stronger signal. You don't attract what you want, you attract what you embody. And when you embody clarity, peace, and self-trust, people who live in chaos won't feel at home around you anymore. And that's a good thing. They'll either rise or disappear, because a secure person won't try to hijack your boundaries. They won't punish you for expressing your needs. They won't disappear just to test how much you care. Instead, they'll bring you stability. And listen closely, if stability makes you uncomfortable, that's the wound, not the relationship. So the work isn't just about walking away from avoidance. It's about walking toward yourself, toward the version of you who no longer tolerates crumbs, who isn't afraid to be alone if it means preserving your peace, who knows that real love doesn't require shrinking, guessing, or begging. You're not meant to fix someone's emotional avoidance. You're meant to build a relationship where emotional availability is the norm, not the exception. So stop waiting for someone to meet you halfway when they've barely shown up at all. You don't need to chase what's aligned for you. You attract it by becoming the version of yourself who no longer settles. Secure love begins when you realize your healing is not a rehearsal. It's the main event. Act like it.